Hello, everybody. Welcome. So glad you could come. So glad you would even consider going to Cuba. And who wouldn't? First of all, I'd like to say that I'm grateful to our sponsors. Katrina and New City Brewery for hosting the forum, Cassandra and Laudable Productions for suggesting we combine the forum with the Mill Pond Live concert and performance by Simafunk. Wait till you hear them. To Mavis Anderson of the Latin America Working Group for her collaboration on the forum. We schemed it up over the phone just a month and a half ago. To Mayor Nicole LaChapelle for offering to host a conversation with Simafunk. To Jen Ramsey and Easthampton Media for agreeing to advertise and then tape the forum so that everybody will be able to see it who isn't here. And finally to the Resistance Center for Peace and Justice for taking the forum on as their own and helping to form the Cuba Action Group to push forward lifting the travel ban and ending the embargo. And there's a sign-up sheet there if you want to even just receive notices or if you want to be able to take action. What I want to talk about is this. Who says you can't travel to Cuba? It's a lie. The United States decided 60 years ago to impose an embargo on Cuba. It's called Trading with the Enemy, and it is administered by the executive branch of the US government. The embargo applies to all types of exchanges, including monetary and commercial. In 1996, the US Congress enshrined the embargo in the Helms-Burton Act. The executive still administers it, but it will now take an act of Congress to eliminate it completely. The embargo works. It keeps Cuba without a lot of the necessary daily supplies, which must be brought from great distances, must be paid for in hard currency in a situation where Cuba's own money is not convertible. Ships delivering supplies to Cuba cannot dock in a US port for 6 months. Foreign banks that trade with the US have severe restrictions on banking with Cuba, and manufactured goods and spare parts that contain even a small percentage or interest or raw materials are prohibited. And for many, many years, Cuba was cut off from all but a very few people in the United States by the same embargo, and by a fierce propaganda war that portrayed the Cuban Revolution as repressive, joyless, and forbidding. Cubans. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that the embargo cost the U.S. economy $1.2 billion per year in lost sales and exports, while the Cuban government estimates that the embargo has cost the island itself $753.69 billion. Even into the 1990s, people had an image of Cuba as dark, rigid, and foreboding. Anybody else here think that that's the case? No one wanted to go there for fun. No one thought there was anything there to be learned or experienced. Due to the work of challenging the regulations and ensuring that ordinary people could go more and more, see the travel brochures from Common Ground, Cuba Educational Travel, and Witness for Peace on the resource table. The latter two still have to get here. Plus the work of people like Congressman Jim McGovern and Senator Jeff Flake, helped by people like Mavis Anderson and the Latin America Working Group. People now know that Cuba is a great place to visit. Cuba is wonderful, open, joyous, and charming, both because of its unique history and culture and because it is committed to building a just and fair society, all of which Augustine Lau will talk about. This mixture has created a sense of community in which people are in the soup together or rising with the steam from the soup together. This makes Cuba unique, even among Caribbean countries, and everyone feels that when they go. What happened? The regulations in place today are not the regulations of a decade ago, nor of 2 decades ago, nor of 3 decades ago. Why? Because we have continuously pushed and challenged in the courts, in Congress, and with our feet. And while we slip backwards regularly, we never slip back all the way to the beginning. The first time I went to Cuba in 1969, I was a working class woman of 26. I wanted to see what Cuba was like, and all travel was there was prohibited. I joined a group of US and Cuban students, Black, white, and Latinx, and cut sugarcane for a month, then toured the country. To do that, I had to sneak out of the country through Mexico and return on a cattle boat to Canada. The FBI went to my job and tried to get me fired for having been to Cuba. The first person to challenge the travel prohibition, though, was African-American journalist William Worthy in the earlier 1960s. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court. Since then, there has been a steady history of US Americans of all backgrounds building bridges with Cuba and challenging the travel ban in courts, in Congress, and with civil disobedience. In response to these challenges, and depending on who is in the White House, the travel regulations have changed repeatedly. And with the exception of a brief period of time under President George Bush, the regulations are nowhere near as harsh as in the beginning. No more cattle boats. The man currently in the White House changed the regulations again after he came into office. Why? Because Cuba, the embargo of Cuba, the regulations and restrictions on Cuba, including travel, have since the beginning been a political pawn corresponding neither to geopolitical nor practical reason. And since that man tends to play a shell game with people's lives and livelihoods, do we all agree? When the current set of regulations went into place on June 5th, 2019, they gave every appearance of stifling travel as never before. And it's not true. You can still travel to Cuba, and you can do so legally with your passport and directly from the United States. There are several categories of authorized travel, meaning you do not have to ask the US government for permission to go. You simply have to understand and abide by the rules. The rules are written and arbitrated by the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the US Treasury Department, OFAC. These regulations are found online, and it is important that you read them yourselves so that you have a clear understanding of what is and is not included in the regulated activities. And often people carry a copy with them because if they should be questioned when they come back, 10 to 1, the immigration people at the border haven't read them and don't know. You can get the web address for the regulations at the resource table. The primary categories under the current regulations are, these are the categories where you don't have to ask permission ahead of time, you just have to know the rules and follow them. Family visits, meaning primarily Cuban Americans visiting their families, support for the Cuban people, humanitarian projects, professional and academic research and professional meetings, official government business, journalistic activity, educational activities, religious activities, public performances, clinics, workshops, athletic and other competitions and exhibitions, activities of private foundations or research or educational institutes. That's pretty broad, isn't it? I'm going to talk about the categories most accessible to individuals for travel. Other than that, for Cuban Americans visiting family. There's a brochure from Common Ground for individual travel in support of the Cuban people. And for group travel, I encourage you to read the brochures from Witness for Peace and Cuba Educational Travel, or to look up the Venceremos Brigade or Pastors for Peace. Support for the Cuban people, my favorite. As who doesn't want to support the Cuban people? It's defined by OFAC as requiring the traveler to engage in a full-time schedule of activities that enhance contact with the Cuban people, support civil society in Cuba, I'm quoting, or promote the Cuban people's independence from Cuban authorities and that result in meaningful interactions with individuals in Cuba. Well, promoting independence from the Cuban authorities is a ridiculous activity for a first-time visitor, or maybe for any visitor. The rest works. You can stay in a private home, eat at the fabulous private restaurants called Paladares, Take a ride in a privately owned classic car, including one driven by my nephew, a '55 Chevy convertible. Book a yoga class in a private spa, take dance lessons, go to nightclubs, hire a local guide to take you on a walking tour or to the countryside, walk yourself around neighborhoods and make new friends. To be honest, it's difficult to be bored in Cuba, and there are dozens of people ready to help make your visit enjoyable. Many people make friends for life. Humanitarian projects, that's another good one. OFAC gives us an example. A group of friends, this is from them, a group of friends traveling to Cuba could maintain a full-time schedule volunteering with a recognized non-governmental organization to build a school. The Venceremos Brigade has, for 60 years, had projects in Cuba with the non-governmental organization, the Institute of Friendship with the Peoples, building housing for people and doing other voluntary work. So has the Martin Luther King Center, working with Witness for Peace and Pastors for Peace. Other humanitarian organizations in the U.S. sponsor trips that provide medicine and medical supplies. Look for someone in the crowd wearing a badge that says, "I've been to Cuba, ask me," there's a lot of them, and ask them how they went. Academic and professional research, professional meetings. Again, look around the crowd for someone wearing an "I've been to Cuba" badge. Many professors at our local institutions, including Professor Augustine Lau, who will be speaking with you, have been to Cuba to do professional research in their field. It requires a full-time schedule of activities. And we all know that professors, what does their full-time schedule consist of? Teaching a few classes. Anyway, it's not 10 hours a day. But you need to do informal interviews with people, visit to institutions relevant to your field, make observations, and take notes. Photograph, talk with people. Professional meetings means attending an international meeting that happens to be held in Cuba. For instance, the American Psychological Association has been attending meetings in Cuba for more than 5 years. Am I making my point? Got it? The regulations are put in place by the U.S. executive to try to keep you separated from your Cuban brothers and sisters. But, importantly, we have a U.S. Constitution that, try as they might, they have not been able to contravene. What's important is to read the regulations, understand the regulations, think about how to apply them creatively but strictly, and then go and enjoy yourself. Listen to what Augustine Lau says about the Cuban people and their history and culture, and then build your ideal trip around what most attracts and draws you, what you most feel you have to share with your brothers and sisters. Then, listening to what Mavis Anderson has to say, come back and insist on lifting the embargo of Cuba, starting with the bills currently in Congress, and you will see there are several of them. Push our own Representative Richard Neal to sign on to H.R. 3960, lifting the travel ban. Jim McGovern, other people's congressmen, introduced it. Challenge Senator Markey to sign on to the Senate version. Elizabeth Warren says she supports lifting the travel restrictions and the embargo. Bird dog her on the campaign trail and insists that she put that forward in her campaign. But first, go there. Thank you. Now, Augustine Lau. Augustine Lau Montes was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico. He received his BA from the Catholic University of Puerto Rico and his master's and doctorate from the University of New York, Binghamton. He's professor of sociology and Afro-American studies at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His fields of specialty include world historical sociology and globalization, social identities and social inequalities, sociology of race and ethnicity, African diaspora and Latino studies, and others. He teaches and travels extensively throughout the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Just returned from Cuba, where he attended and made presentations at the annual Caribbean Festival, and will be spending his upcoming sabbatical in Cuba. We are honored to have him. Augustine.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes. I'm really happy that I'm here. I thought that I was going to be in Cuba and that I was not going to be able to make it, but I am going to Cuba next week. I'll tell you a little bit about it, but before giving my short presentation, because we don't want to talk too much that we can have more of a dialogue, I really want to ask for applause for Mary and Sarah because, it's incredible the work in recognition of this event, but also 40 years of solidarity with Cuba and building bridges between the people of Cuba and the people of the United States. Please, for Mary. We honor to have her in our community here. I say our community because I live in Amherst, but my daughter lives in Easthampton, so somehow I also from this community in Easthampton. I have been going to Cuba for some 30 years. I mean, Mary went to Cuba before I went, but we both have a long-term relationship with Cuba. And, I want to say a few things about what that can mean for us here in Western Mass, in Easthampton, the kind of work that we do here. One thing is that I think it's important to highlight what Mary just said, which is that we can travel to Cuba. And I do go to Cuba all the time. I'm going there for an extended period of time to do research. I have in my sabbatical next year, so I'm going to Cuba for half a year to do some research there and to work with community also, because my research is participatory action research. I work with community organizations. I will work with 2 communities there in Havana. These people-to-people kind of exchange, bridging people-to-people relationship is really important. No? And the Cuba and the United States, as you know, our histories are intertwined. The history of Cuba and the history of the United States are together. You cannot understand one without the other. This is one of the things that was actually brought to attention when Obama went to Cuba, and he said that the Cold War is over, even though you have people like Trump, etc., trying to revive the Cold War and use Cold War kind of rhetoric in order to exploit a false issue between Cuba and the United States in order to capture the conservative vote, especially the Cuban conservative vote, which is not the only Cuban vote, actually, of course. But the Cold War is over, and the embargo and try to create obstacles in the relationship between Cuban people and U.S. people doesn't make any sense. I mean, if it ever did in some kind of geopolitical, historical scenario, it doesn't make sense at all today, no? And people like Mary and many other people have all the way through cultivating those exchanges of different sort. Mary mentioned that the American Psychological Association philosophers meet in Cuba every year, people of certain ages, people who do social work. Because, also as Mary said, Cuba is a very special place. No, it's the largest of the islands of the Caribbean. It's have a very distinguished and unique history. Cuba was one of the countries in which more people came from Africa during the slave trade, and of course a lot of free black people who built one of the most robust and vibrant black cultures of the Americas. And today actually we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of Benny Moré. I don't know how many of you know about, tropical music, Cuban music? Benny Moré was a very important figure during the time of big bands, and Cap Calloway used to go there, etc. He had a big band there. Today we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of Benny Moré throughout the world, no? Because Cuban popular culture is, and black culture in particular also, is actually a major contribution to world culture in music, in dance, and the culture industry of Cuba actually has been very vibrant for over 100 years. There were more radios per capita in Cuba at the beginning of the 20th century than the United States. So I mean, there are foundations in terms of why Cuba is such an influential culture and unique. I mean, and in terms of literary culture also have a very strong tradition. So all of these things coalesce now in a really interesting and seductive, kind of seductive in the good sense of the word, popular culture. And of course, the politics is quite unique. It's quite unique since the 19th century, the 1959 revolution, with all which have a long history already. 1959 until 2019, and with up and downs and with a lot of complexities. And I happen to be a student of Cuban history, culture, politics, and the Cuban Revolution is one of the things that I study. One of my research projects now is a comparison of Cuba and Puerto Rico. I was born in Puerto Rico, and there is this old saying from the 19th century that Cuba and Puerto Rico are two wings of the same bird. You probably heard that, no? And the comparative histories of Cuba and Puerto Rico are very important to shed light on a lot of issues in the Americas. For example, when we had the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico that almost destroyed the infrastructure of the island, we had a similar situation in Cuba, and that didn't happen. Interesting, no? Because we were told during the Cold War that we were the developed people in Puerto Rico, and in Cuba were underdeveloped, etc. And it happened that they were more prepared than Puerto Rico to handle the situation of the hurricanes. But another thing that I think is important to highlight about Cuba today, and why it's an important and interesting place to go today, is that it's going through very significant changes. I mean, there was a constitutional change. There was a change of presidency. The Castros are not in executive power in Cuba anymore. And there is a really interesting transition that have many different nuances to it. And so people like Mary and I, who have been going to Cuba for a long time, we have seen the changes. And some of the changes we are critical. Other of the changes are very exciting. I mean, there is a process of economic reform, for instance, that is liberalizing to small businesses. So there has been a boom of restaurants, of nightclubs, which actually I see a lot of positive things in terms of that. There is a big discussion actually about what are the meanings of the constitutional change, of the change of executive power, of the economic reforms that we actually at UMass Amherst have a Cuban studies group. We have like 6 people who were professors in the University of Havana who are doing their PhDs in UMass. And we have a Cuban studies group, and we organize events at UMass also in which we have discussed all of these issues. And this is something else that is very interesting in Cuba, that there is an open process of booming, of much more public debate and discourse, which I will argue is a process of democratization of Cuban society in the good sense of the word. But in any case, I want to leave you, and we can go on talking a lot about Cuba, because it's a very again, it's a very interesting, important place for the Americas and for the world, and it's a place that I always nurture my hunger for learning, for understanding, and for contributing to the world to be a better place to be. But I think that we should be very clear that this is a very crucial political issue. The issue of advocating for the relationship people to people between the Cuban people and the US people to be something that we have a right. It's a human right that we have to relate to each other. And there are so many things that we can learn from each other in many different ways, like this group Cyberpunk, for example, that we are that is performing. There is a very good and powerful relationship between hip hop culture in Cuba and in the United States. There were in the 1990s in which hip hop became like a social movement in Cuba. A few concerts called what was the name? Black radical exchanges between Harlem and Cuba, no? And this kind of exchanges between artists, between intellectuals, between activists, between people from communities to people from communities. This is what we need to advocate for. We should not allow the tyranny of the kind of neo-fascist authoritarian presidency that we have to be in the middle of the right that we have as a people to relate to the people of Cuba, to go there, to build bridges, and to have solidarity with each other. I leave you with that message.
That was pretty wonderful. Next, Mavis Anderson. Mavis is Senior Associate at the Latin America Working Group in Washington, D.C., a coalition of national nonprofits working to change U.S. policy toward Latin America. She directed LOG's Cuba program for over 20 years. The primary focus of her work has been with grassroots activists, motivating them to urge their members of Congress to support legislation ending the embargo. As well, she coordinated with key members of Congress and their aides in drafting and promoting legislation to end the travel ban and trade embargo. She's traveled to Cuba dozens of times over the last 20 years. So, Mavis, you want to talk to some grassroots activists?
I am a new resident of Massachusetts. Thank you. 2.5 months, so I'm still getting my sea legs here, but it's delightful to be here, and I am really charmed by your community. So thank you very much for having me here. This has been a difficult political time for Cuba work, as you might imagine. It's been difficult for most any kind of work. I've worked in D.C. for more than 20 years organizing in opposition to the embargo. And yeah. Is that better? No. Okay, I'll talk louder. Is that better? Okay, I'll lean in or bring it to me. We've had our ups and downs. There were some wonderful up times under President Obama, where Cuba was taken off the list of state sponsors of terrorism, where it shouldn't have been. Cuba and the United States simultaneously made an announcement that they were restarting diplomatic relations. Embassies were reopened in both countries. People-to-people travel was made much easier with direct flights from the United States, and you could just call up an airline and say, I want a ticket to Cuba, and you could go. all of that was quite wonderful. Now, as you might imagine, Trump is trying to reverse everything that Obama did. He is challenging the progress that we made. He is testing it, and he is rolling back the changes that Obama made to make connections between Cubans and U.S. citizens much more difficult. He's canceled Obama's deals. He ended people-to-people travel, first individual and then group. He expelled 15 Cuban diplomats from the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., and he all but closed the U.S. embassy in Havana. The consulate in Havana has closed, and the United States is no longer issuing visas for Cubans to travel to the United States in Cuba. Cubans have to travel to a third country to apply for a visa to come to the United States. He issued a travel warning about traveling to Cuba, now downgraded to an advisory, but it scared a lot of people off. And as Mary has said, it's a lie. You can still travel to Cuba. He limited remittances from Cubans who live in the States that they send back to their families in Cuba to $1,000 per quarter. Under Obama, there were no limits. You could send as much money to Cuba as you wanted. It's cruel, and it hurts the Cuban people rather than the Cuban government. We don't want to hurt the Cuban government either, but Trump's policies hurt the Cuban people, especially those who are starting new businesses and rely upon remittances from the states to help support their opening their new businesses. It hurts the Cuban economy, and it also hurts U.S. citizens and our desire to relate to our Cuban brothers and sisters. So what can we do about it? First of all, travel. Travel. Go to Cuba. Tell others to go to Cuba. Come back and tell others about your experience in Cuba and encourage them to go too. Out on our resource table, there are all kinds of resources that tell you how to do that. The regulations are there. There are other resources that will help you learn how you can go to Cuba. Secondly, support legislation. The embargo to Cuba has been written into law, so the only way for us to end it is to write it out of law. There are several bills in the Congress, but I'm going to focus on the travel bills. There are 2 travel bills that we are supporting, one in the House and one in the Senate. And what would be really wonderful is if you would all leave here and tomorrow or Monday pick up the phone and call your member of Congress and say, I want you to co-sponsor the Freedom for Americans to Travel to Cuba Act. In the House, and this is out on the resource table also, the bill is H.R. 3960. It was introduced by Congressman McGovern. I wish I could clone him 435 times. He's a wonderful representative. And Congressman Emmer from Minnesota, who's a Republican. And this is probably the only thing that I agree with him on, but he's really good on Cuba. So we are supporting their bill. The goal that Congressman McGovern has is to get 100 co-sponsors in the House by the end of October. So our job is to help him do that. There are postcards out on the resource table for you to sign to Congressman Neal, who is not yet on this bill, and we will hand deliver them for you if you will just sign the postcards. The bill in the Senate, which is a companion bill to the House bill, basically the identical bill, is S-2303, and it was introduced by Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat from Vermont. He's already got 46 co-sponsors. This is great. That's almost 50. 50 is half of the Senate. 60 makes it veto-proof. So our job here is to get those last 10, 15 senators to sign on to this bill. You are fortunate, we are fortunate, because both of your senators are already on board. So give them a call and thank them and tell them to make it a priority. Support it actively. Get other senators to sign on. September 9th, the Senate and the House are back in session, and that's a perfect time to call your member of Congress's office and say, sign on these bills, support them actively, get your colleagues to sign on also. There is a sign-up sheet out on the resource table from the Latin America Working Group, which would allow you to get occasional, I don't dump a lot of stuff in your email inbox, occasional action alerts. When there's a piece of legislation that needs your attention, we give you talking points, we give you scripts, we give you phone numbers, and make it as easy as we can for you to call your member of Congress and get them on board. The last thing that you can do is to make this an issue in the presidential campaigns. Senator Warren needs to hear from you. She's on board with the travel bill, but we want her to make it an issue in her campaign that she talks about in debates, that she talks about on the campaign trail, that she commits to acting on if she's elected president. It's been almost 60 years of an embargo on Cuba. 60 years is too much, enough, basta. It's time to end this, and I hope that we can count on you to help. Thanks very much.
Is this on? Is this on now? Yes. So now, we'd like to take your questions. And I'm going to do something that I hope you'll agree with. I would like to take questions primarily from people who have not been to Cuba and maybe don't know a lot about this issue first. There'll be a lot of time to talk informally about Cuba, both outside after the forum and all through the concert.
So Via Heroes, we just found them on the internet. I don't know that much about them. They apparently have people in Cuba who will set up a tour, a custom tour for you that is legal, and I'm wondering if anybody has ever used this group. Via Hero is the name of it.
Another question. We don't know about them, but anyway you go to Cuba is just fine. Another question? Yes.
Are they expecting you to have a dossier of what you're going to be doing down there as far as...
The question is, do you have to have a dossier? Now, this is very interesting because you almost never get asked anymore when you come back. But you should be prepared. You should keep a notebook of your activities. If you're going to for support for the Cuban people, then you'll have a record of where you stayed, whether you booked it directly online or through Airbnb or whatever. You'll have keep a journal. That's the easiest way, and say where you ate and what you thought of the food. If you take a ride in a car with my nephew Eric, I will provide the number. Then just take a picture, et cetera, et cetera. So be prepared to, and besides, if you keep a journal of what you did there, then you'll be all ready for your report back to your circle of friends over coffee or drinks. Right? Break the rules.
Okay,
Why
yeah,
aren't
no,
you
I just-
wearing
I
a
just
thing
want- I
that
just
says
wanna make
I've
a
been to
comment.
Cuba? Ask because we want people to be able
I
to
think
ask.
when we're discussing travel to Cuba, I think it's important to make a distinction. Put things in two different categories. One is if you're trying to comply with U.S. law, and one is if you're not. You can go and challenge the law. That's how I usually go. I go with the Venceremos Brigade. So we challenge the law. Pastors for Peace challenges the law. Pastors for Peace, yes. Okay, I'm just making a point. You need to decide if you're going to Cuba, when you're going to Cuba, if you want to go according to U.S. law and follow those rules, or if you want to challenge the rules. That's the first distinction you have to make. Okay? That's my only comment. Okay.
I think that's well-founded. And let me explain. When I went in 1969, it was with the very first Venceremos Brigade, and I just went to the 50th anniversary of the brigade. I should have called you. The travel challenges were a very important political tactic that was used for many, many, many years to draw attention to the illegality and immorality of the travel ban. And during the special period, which was a time of economic collapse, near collapse in Cuba, following the collapse of the socialist countries of Europe, Pastors for Peace formed, which took caravans. Liz, would you explain Pastors for Peace? Not to put you on the spot. Liz organized many Pastor for Peace trips out of Western Massachusetts. And if you don't mind just saying a word about it, because it was such important work. Oh, yeah, I put you on the spot. I did.
So, yeah, I've been with Pastors for Peace. I've been with Witness for Peace. I went on a delegation that Mary organized. You can go a lot of different ways. You can go legally. You can go to make a statement that we don't feel like we need to go legally. But Pastors for Peace, for many, many years, organized caravans. And these caravans went through every of the lower 48 states every night, making a presentation to people and eventually coming down to the southern border with a huge amount of donated material, tons and tons of donated material. And here in Northampton, I don't know if any of you used to come to, we sponsored the Pastors for Peace every year in Northampton. It was always very exciting and to hear about what was going on and to feel like we were making a contribution to the well-being of Cuba. Now, I'm really not sure. It's changed a little bit, but they're still going every year, and it's really worth, if you're interested, just Google Pastors for Peace, see what they're doing now, and it's a really great way to go. And one of the reasons it's great is that Cuba loves Pastors for Peace, because Pastors for Peace is political, has supported the revolution, has supported Fidel, and when you go with Pastors for Peace, you get into places and you meet people you might not ever meet otherwise. So I would encourage you to do that. It's a wonderful organization, has tremendous integrity.
I just want to add very briefly that there's room for both kinds of travel challenges and travel that abides by the regulations. But what's important for both kinds of travel is that our work is here. Our work is here. If we want this embargo to end, we have to come home from Cuba and we have to be active and we have to get the legislation passed so that the embargo ends once and for all. Our work is here in the States.
Thank you, Mavis. And I agree, even though I'm going to say something else. The other thing that Pastors for Peace does, and I want everybody here to know this because it's really important, following Hurricane Oscar, I think it was, that devastated Central America, Cuba, which of course sent medical aid and assistance, as they always do, realized that they could keep doing that ad infinitum, but what Central America needed was more doctors. So they started something called the Latin American School of Medicine. And there are doctors, for instance, the only doctors in East Timor were trained in Cuba. Ethiopia, which had 100 doctors when Haile Selassie was overthrown, trains doctors in Cuba. But guess what? there are 500 slots set aside for U.S. students. So if you have, looking at this crowd, I would say sons and daughters or grandchildren, who want to study medicine, they can do so at no cost in Cuba. And it is not a post-bachelor's study. It is 5 years out of high school. And the only condition is that they must come back and work for, is it 2 or 3 years, I can't remember which, in an underserved community before they go on to make their millions. Or they can keep serving in the underserved community. But this is a very important collaboration and really illustrates what Augustine was saying about how we have a natural and direct relationship. More questions?
I've heard Trump's latest impact was to not allow us to go to any government hotels or restaurants. Does that spill over into other facilities? Is it hard to get into?
No government hotels or restaurants. Now, this is very interesting. Yes, we are prohibited from staying in any hotels that are owned by the government or the military. Now, I don't know what that means, whether we can or cannot stay in Starwood Sheraton managed hotels in Cuba. And there's a debate I've heard where there are some people saying, yes, you can do it. You just have to book through somebody else. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that neither the government nor the military owns the majority of hotels in Cuba. They are independent hotel chains that come out of the Ministry of Tourism, under the Ministry of Tourism, yes. But, so yes and no. But if you're going to support the Cuban people, then I recommend you stay in a private home. It's going to be a better experience. They have better air conditioning, better hot water oftentimes, unless you have a lot of money and can stay in the 5 stars.
Very practical that a lot of people do not necessarily know. Cuba is fully into Airbnb, as Mary mentioned. So you go into Airbnb and you're going to find lots of places where to stay there. And the other thing is that there are flights from Hartford, and there are direct flights from Boston to Havana. I'm going direct flight from Boston to Havana next Saturday.
And I'm sorry, I just realized that I was hogging the answers. More questions? More questions?
I just want to divert for one moment that if you do use Airbnb, it would be really helpful if you could also protest to them that they advertise in the occupied territories in Palestine.
Thank you. Do you want to shout or you want the microphone?
Do any of you know why this administration is so opposed to people going to Cuba?
One, because Obama was in favor of it. 2, because there are advisors in the White House who are Cuba haters. There's a man who's in charge of Latin America and the Caribbean in the National Security Council, whose name is Mauricio Claver Carón. He has, for years, been opposed to this. Then there's the National Security Advisor himself, John Bolton, who has also had a vendetta against Cuba for decades. He's a hawk all the way around and certainly towards Cuba. And then there's Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, Republican, who has Trump's ear on this. So all of the advisors that he has chosen are advisors who are anti-engagement with Cuba. Trump himself, were he given the opportunity, wants to build hotels in Cuba.
And not only
This
that,
is true. This is true.
he actually spent $68,000 sending somebody on an exploratory trip before the last election.